Good evening, vagrants. One more video after this, a conclusion, and today, this day, is the last day you can interact with the narrative. And we'll try to get through this one quick. I want to make other videos, but I also don't want to leave the vagrants hanging. Without further ado, let's recap Thursday's events. Thursday morning. Ellis Baker begins the morning checking his traps set around the forests. There's a spattering of rain through the mist. It's cold. 2 of the snares are empty. The third contains a rabbit, but it's dead, torn to shreds. Ellis Baker salvages what meat he can and resets the snare. Alone in his tent, Horatio Jasperson channels his vagrant soul and engineers an unholy weapon with his treasures. From a pipe, a saw, and some wires, he spawns a wretched cross that looks more like an axe than an icon. The weapon possesses a satisfying heft. Perhaps the cross represents the vagrant's tattered mind more than it does any sort of spirituality. There's no redemption in this weapon. Before sunrise, Paul Norsky enters Squander and sneaks into Little Morocco through an attached but abandoned building. He passes through the upstairs bar and descends the stairs into the outfitting shop. And there was a language issue here. So in the United States, an outfitter is a backwoods contractor who guides tourists, often hunters, through rough terrain, often for an extended period. You'll sometimes hear them referred to as guides too, but outfitter is the most common word I hear for this sort of worker. So Paul Norsky reviews the limited selection of clothes. The options are sturdy, rough outdoors wear, and a more varied ethnic selection, the latter likely displayed more for the owner's satisfaction than for profit. From the former selection, Paul Norsky steals clothes one might see a long-time Squander resident wearing, including a strange cowboy hat and sunglasses. The ensemble is strange, but it's superior to rags. He exits the store the way he came. Afternoon. Ellis Baker transforms what remains of the rabbit carcass into something edible. The flavor won't astound, and it looks horrific, but it won't make anyone sick. Ellis Baker doesn't mind. He brings his cooked rabbit into Squander to eat and to people watch. While he's walking into town, most people avoid his eyes. Others make a point of creating distance between themselves and the vagrant with the terrible flesh wrapped in newspaper. A shopkeeper watching from a window makes a telephone call. Before Ellis Baker can sit down on a bench in the town square, a deputy arrives in a huff and chases him off. Back in the fog, Horatio Jasperson visits the Tabernacle of the Wayward to request Father Cornelius Wolfram anoint his holy weapon. The holy man looks between the vagrant, repeating the words, "Anoint God and kill," and the chunk of mangled and rusted metal balanced across the vagrant's shoulder. Cornelius shakes his head but agrees. Horatio Jasperson hands him the flask of industrial oil, and Cornelius, still hesitant, blesses the weapon with God's grace. It's no blood of Christ, but the grease of industry will do. Paul Norsky... Jesus, my fucking mouse. Here we go. Okay. Paul Norsky spent most of the day playing cat and mouse with the cops. In this vagrant's case, clothes do not make the man. The disguise might work on a cleaner body, but Paul Norsky comes across exactly like the vagrants Squander townsfolk have come to despise. Regardless, he hasn't been chased from the town's limits. He's too evasive. Between bouts of running and hiding, Paul Norsky locates the Sallow Times, the office from which Janie Barber submits her news about the little town of Squander. He enters one of the building's empty rooms through an alley window and catches his breath. He hears the 2 officers complaining outside. They're winded and, quotes, wasn't supposed to be working today. Then Paul Norsky notices something to his right. There's a woman aiming a revolver at him. With an expression that's hard to place, she's still and silent. Surprised, Norsky manages only to put a finger over his mouth. The woman says nothing. Moments pass and the cops leave. Paul Norsky presumes the woman to be reporter Janie Barber. She hasn't lowered her gun. Paul Norsky manages to mention 3 words: murder, monster, and muter. Janie Barber steps closer. Her eyes bulge. "You get the fuck away from me and keep that name out of your filthy mouth." She spits at the vagrant, but in her rage, misses. "Out. Now." Hands raised, Paul Norsky climbs back out the window. It slams shut behind him. This afternoon, Paul Norsky was not shot 6 times and then 6 times again. Now we move into night. When night falls, Ellis Baker hears grumbling around the fog. Someone's doing something. There's a man with an ungodly contraption over his shoulder, shouting and riling everyone up. Uneasy, Ellis Baker flees to the peace of the forest. Despite the darkness and weather, he makes his way to his spot of peace and reflection. There are no machines this late. Almost nobody runs the machines after 7 p.m. This means there's no vibrational resonance in the air, but the spot is comfortable all the same. Ellis Baker sits on a log, clasps his hands, and prays for everyone's safety. Remembering the unnatural teenager's tears, he includes a prayer for, quotes, the beast's well-being. Back in the Hooverville fog, Horatio Jasperson has rounded up a group of 10 men and women willing to follow him into action. The social situation is odd. Without a threat, he might not have gathered anyone to follow him. With the threat, he organizes a brave few, but everyone is so frightened, activity outside the fog's boundaries has dropped almost to nothing. This mouse is killing me. Everyone is holing up and playing safe. Armed with odds and ends and a few crucifixes, the hunting party follows their leader into the deep, dark woods, hoping to resolve this issue once and for all. In Squander, Paul Norsky locates Fisher Fishing, the combination business owned and operated by Salty Muter and Little Muter, his son. The storefront looks to be closed, but Paul Norsky sees lights in the fishery. Someone's home. The door is unlocked. Paul Norsky enters the large, arched building. Inside are a series of tanks filled with water and fish. None of the species present are native to the Northeast. The building is warm, the air is heavy and moist. The fish swim about in the low light. Across the building, Paul Norsky sees a man sitting in a chair. In his hand is a bottle of whiskey. Paul Norsky approaches him. He asks the man if he's Peter Muter. Peter, the man says. His skin is weathered and his eyes are distant. The vagrant explains he knows what happened to the man's wife. He explains he knows about his son's condition. Salty Muter is despondent. He doesn't seem surprised. Lost both of them the same day I did, Salty says. One that morning, one that night. He drinks. We should have all gone together, all together at once. Now it's all screwy. God in heaven couldn't help dragging it out. He drinks. Paul Norsky asks Salty about the man in the suit. Heard of him, Salty says. G-Man. Heard he was asking around about my boy when he first showed up. That's about it. I don't know. I can't help you. Couldn't help Charlotte. Couldn't help Little. Can't help myself. He drinks. There comes a noise across the building. He looks past the vagrant. There's my boy now. Oh my god, this fucking mouse. Maybe he can help you. Across the fishery walks a silhouette in a ball cap and a bandana. I smelled you, the silhouette says. His fingers extend into sharp points. Salty shakes his head. No, he's not going to help you. The man covers his eyes with his free hand. Little comes closer. His skin is taut and discolored. Paul Norsky draws his derringer and aims. He fires and misses. Salty staggers out of his chair. Little comes even closer. Paul Norsky's hands shake. In all his years on the wrong side of the law, this consummate professional has never fired a gun, much less killed a living being. On instinct, maybe in terror, he closes his eyes and pulls the trigger. The footsteps stop. There's a gurgling. Paul Norsky opens his eyes and, to everyone's surprise, the shot connected. There's a hole in Little's throat. It's leaking blood. Before Paul can process what's happened, Salty smashes a bottle of whiskey over the vagrant's head. Paul Norsky drops his empty derringer and runs. He's bleeding. He hears one of the Peters pursuing him. He exits the fishery and runs into the nearby woods. Using the brush for cover and moving toward the fog's lights in the distance, Paul Norsky continues running. Something stumbles through the trees after him. Paul Norsky spots nearer lights, moving lights. Crashing through the bushes, he falls into Horatio Jasperson's hunting party and gives everyone a huge fright. Not enough time for words has passed before Little breaks through the same bushes and attempts to descend on the fallen Paul Norsky. The young man is bleeding from the throat profusely but hasn't died. He's barely slowed down. Before Little can rip Paul Norsky or anyone else to shreds, Horatio Jasperson smashes him across the head with his salvaged and weaponized cross. Little staggers backward. There's no reaction at first aside from the blunt force trauma. Then, as it did last time, his skin begins to sear. The searing comes slowly, but it makes its mark. Other vagrants in the party approach him with their crucifixes upraised. Manic, Little knocks aside one of the vagrants without a crucifix and runs away. Mistakenly, or perhaps intentionally, he runs straight toward the Hooverville fog and disappears in the darkness. And that wraps up Thursday's events. You have the thing cornered. All you need to do is root it out and resolve the situation. If you can. Wouldn't it suck to be this close and then fumble it? Or maybe that's what you want to happen. Maybe you want this thing to get away. We will see what happens. On screen are the final character sheets. All our vagrants are armed and homeless and ready to go. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't.